We're going to start our discussion today by looking at a very strange little book by Joris Karl Huysmans, published in French in 1884 as A rebours. That phrase literally means in reverse or backwards, though English translators have rendered the title Against Nature or Against the Grain, which better captures the spirit of the main character and his mission to rid his life of all natural and commonplace reminders of the everyday world. The story is told from the perspective of a minor aristocrat named Des Esseintes, who, fed up with Parisian society, uses what's left of his inheritance to move away from the city into a suburban home. He sets out on a kind of monastic existence, but rather than devoting himself to God, his religion is one of beauty and pleasure. His goal is to transform his entire life into a work of art that has nothing to do with reality. The literature he reads, the colors of his walls, the paintings he hangs thereupon, the perfumes he inhales, the liquors he ingests, the potted plants that line his hallways, every detail is meticulously arranged according to his extremely cultivated tastes. Chapter 5 is an overview of his tastes in the visual arts. And at the opening of this chapter, we get a summary of his aesthetic inclinations toward, quote, evocative works which would transport him to some unfamiliar world, point the way to new possibilities, and shake up his nervous system by means of erudite fancies, complicated nightmares, suave and sinister visions. In other words, Des Esseintes doesn't want the peasant scenes and country landscapes of realist painters. He wants to be transported to strange vistas through art and even made to feel disturbed by unnatural images. The artist who best encompasses these qualities for Des Esseintes is the real-life French symbolist painter Gustave Moreau. Within the world of the book, Des Esseintes possesses two Moreau paintings, though this is a fictional art collection. Huysmans himself, the author, didn't actually own these paintings. Both paintings that Des Esseintes tells us about, they share the same subject, a biblical figure from the New Testament named Salome. Let's read an excerpt from Huysmans' chapter, his 5th chapter, which I've placed on the Quercus site, where Des Esseintes is regarding the earlier of these two paintings by Moreau, Salome Dancing Before Herod, which was painted between 1874 and 76. So he tells us, her breasts rise and fall, the nipples hardening at the touch of her whirling necklaces. The strings of diamonds glitter against her moist flesh. Her bracelets, her belts, her rings all spit out fiery sparks. And across her triumphal robe, sewn with pearls, patterned with silver, spangled with gold, the jewel cuirass, or breastplate, of which every chain is a precious stone, seems to be ablaze with little snakes of fire, swarming over the matte flesh, over the tea rose skin, like gorgeous insects with dazzling shards, mottled with carmine, spotted with pale yellow, speckled with steel blue, striped with peacock green. Who is this strange and beautiful figure dripping with jewels, wielding a pale lotus blossom and levitating an inch above the ground? To fully appreciate Moreau's paintings and Huysmans' analysis of them through his character Des Esseintes, we need to crack open our Bibles. It's time for Sunday school, kids, so please turn to the Gospel of St. Matthew, the 14th chapter, which reads, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard of the fame of Jesus and said unto his servants, this is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works do shew themselves in him. For Herod had laid hold on John and bound him and put him in her prison for Herodias' sake, his brother Philip's wife. For John said unto him, it is not lawful for thee to have her. And when he, that is, when Herod would have put him, John, to death, he feared the multitude because they counted John as a prophet. But when Herod's birthday was kept, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. Whereupon he promised with an oath to give her whatsoever she would ask. And she, being before instructed of her mother, said, "Give me here John Baptist's head in a charger." And the king was sorry. Nevertheless, for the oath's sake, and them which sat with him at meat, he commanded it to be given to her. And he sent and beheaded John in the prison. And his head was brought on a charger, that is, a platter, and given to the damsel. And she brought it to her mother. And his disciples came, that is, John the Baptist's disciples came, and took up the body and buried it, and went and told Jesus. And Jesus heard of it. He departed thence by ship into a deserted place apart. Thus concludes our gospel reading. So who's this John the Baptist? John the Baptist is also sometimes referred to as John the Forerunner because of his role in paving the way for Christ. An earlier section of the Gospel of Matthew, and by the way, a gospel is one of the four first books of the New Testament, the Christian New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And these books are very special within the New Testament because they tell you about the life of Christ and are filled with his teachings and his deeds and the teachings and deeds of his followers. So in an earlier section of the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew tells us that John the Baptist was a Jewish ascetic, that is, someone who lives a simple life to devote themselves to God. John tells prophecies or divinely inspired predictions about someone greater than he, and he prepares the people of Judea, that is, a region in modern-day Israel, he prepares them for the arrival of this man by conducting a ritual cleansing with river water, a practice called baptism, hence his name, John the Baptist, or one who baptizes. He's not a Southern Baptist. Christ himself went to John to be baptized. And when this happens, John realizes that Jesus is the Messiah figure that he's been prophesying about. He baptizes Christ in the Jordan River, which is why baptism is still practiced in the Christian church. It's also why Christ is so saddened to hear of John the Baptist's death, and he goes out to be alone when he hears the news. So then who are these awful people who carried out such a grisly execution? Matthew, in our earlier reading, refers to Herod the Tetrarch. So what's a tetrarch? That word comes from the same Greek word tetra as Tetris, a video game. Tetra means four, and in Tetris, the blocks are each composed of four little squares. Arch in tetrarch means to rule. So think of a monarch. A monarch rules alone, as his name implies. Monos meaning alone, and then arch meaning ruler. But Herod the Tetrarch was part of an awkward political situation where he oversaw a quarter of the kingdom of Judea, again, a region that corresponds to modern-day Israel and part of the West Bank. Herod officially answered to Caesar Augustus, as Judea was a kind of colony of Rome. But he also had a duty to the Jewish subjects in his portion of Judea, his 1/4 of Judea, his tetrarchy. When he encounters John, Herod finds himself in a bit of a predicament. Matthew tells us that John was accusing the tetrarch of incest, as Herod had married his sister-in-law Herodias, the ex-wife of Herod's half-brother. Now, by today's law, that's obviously not incest, but according to Jewish law, it was forbidden for a man to marry or have sexual relations with his brother's wife, if his brother was still alive. And the brother, Herod's brother Philip, he's referred to in the Bible, was still alive when he and Herodias divorced, and then Herod married Herodias. So this was, according to the Old Testament law of Leviticus, this was considered incest. Herod probably realizes John has a case against him, which is why he has John imprisoned and almost puts him to death for besmirching his name. He just wants to get rid of this problem quietly. But he's too afraid to kill John because of the possible political ramifications, since many of the Jews considered John a prophet. Herod has also heard wondrous things about John, that he seems like he believes them, including a false rumor that John was dead at some point and rose from the dead. We can conclude then that Herod fears John not only for the political reasons, but also for spiritual ones. That by putting this man to death, he'd be resisting the will of God. Now, Herodias, his wife, or his incestuous wife, according to Jewish law, is totally scandalized and insulted by what John has been saying about her marriage to Herod, that it's incestuous. But she finds a way to force Herod's hand by concocting a little scheme with her daughter on Herod's birthday, which we've heard described. This isn't the last we hear of Herod. In fact, during Jesus' trial, Christ is sent before Herod for a hearing. That's because Christ came from Galilee, which is part of the part of Herod's tetrarchy. So he as part of his trial, he goes to see Herod. But this is the last we hear of Salome. And I'm just realizing now, Matthew doesn't even tell us her name. We only know her as the daughter of Herodias. It's in other sources that we get her name as Salome. But this is the last we hear of this figure. And yet this young woman, whose name we're not even given in Matthew, this young woman, who's a mere footnote to a tiny little anecdote in the Gospels, has inspired thousands of works of art since the Middle Ages. A diverse body of images that I've been giving you just a small sample of in these slides. But in the history of Western art, no one was as obsessed with Salome as the artists of the late 19th century. We might even speak of a Salome mania, or Salomania, if you will, of this period, when every major poet and painter felt obliged to pay homage to Salome, and to a lesser extent, her mother, Herodias. Returning to the Huysmans novel we've been discussing, A Rebours, the main character, Des Esseintes, points out just how little we're told about Salome. He says, "She had always remained a dim and distant figure, lost in a mysterious ecstasy far off in the mists of time, beyond the reach of punctilious pedestrian minds, and accessible only to brains shaken and sharpened and rendered almost clairvoyant by neurosis." Clairvoyant is the ability to tell the future. In other words, a straightforward thinker won't think twice about this minor biblical detail, while an imaginative and somewhat disturbed mind will find something irresistibly intriguing about what's being left unsaid. Indeed, this little fragment of a tale is almost proto-symbolist in its mere evocation of a story. And a rich mythological tradition has accumulated in European culture to fill in the gaps of this 12-verse passage in the Gospel of Matthew. As you'd imagine, the symbolists themselves were obsessed with Salome and contributed the most to the Salomania of the late 19th century. In appropriating Salome into their movement, the symbolists made her more than a mere character, elevating her to the status of one of their mystical symbols. As Des Esseintes observes in A Rebours, quote, "She had become, as it were, the symbolic incarnation of undying lust, the goddess of immortal hysteria, the accursed beauty exalted above all other beauties, the monstrous beast, indifferent, irresponsible, insensible, poisoning everything that approaches her, everything that sees her, everything that she touches." Now, there's something obviously misogynistic about this objectification of Salome as a symbol of depraved feminine sexuality. Huysmans associates her with the stereotype of women as prone to a psychosexual disorder called hysteria. What's more, she becomes a representation of the feminine as something corrupting and dangerous, a beautiful monster that poisons everything she touches. Des Esseintes continues with his analysis of the Moreau painting and points out that the artist has transformed Salome into an Orientalist vision from an imaginary East, that different cultures of the Middle East and South Asia are conflated into an exoticized fairy tale setting in Moreau's painting. Salome herself becomes not only an exotic fantasy, but also an erotic fantasy, an incarnation of the archetypical femme fatale figure. That's a French phrase that translates to fatal woman. The femme fatale is a woman who is sexually irresistible, but has a dangerous side. Yet it's precisely this dangerous side that makes her so enticing for the men, at least for the heterosexual male audiences regarding a femme fatale, a painting or a play. They can fantasize themselves trying to tame these wild women, and they can contemplate whether the sexual escapades with such an uninhibited lover would be worth risking their lives for. The exotic femme fatale figure appeared throughout European art of the 19th century, and especially in opera. We keep returning to Saint-Saëns' Samson and Delilah from 1877, but I think it's a great foil for the modernist works we're looking at. It also encapsulates many of the musical and literary themes of the 19th century, as opposed to the modernist works of the late 19th and early 20th century. It's especially pertinent for our discussion today, since Delilah is a biblical femme fatale, like Salome. Though she's from the Hebrew Old Testament, where Salome is from the New Testament. Delilah, remember, is a beautiful Philistine woman. That is, she's from the tribe of Philistines. She's not there's a figurative term. A Philistine is somebody who doesn't appreciate intellectualism or art. So Delilah is a literal Philistine. She belongs to the tribe who bears that name. So she's a Philistine woman who seduces Samson with that sexy descending line in Mon cœur s'ouvre à toi. Remember that aria that we keep revisiting with its slippery chromatic line. In this case, it signals her danger as a femme fatale figure. Samson, who is an Israelite, he's drawn in by her seductive charms, and probably also by the fact that he'd be literally sleeping with his enemy if he got with her. She uses this as an opportunity to double cross him and cut his hair, which is the magical source of his superhuman strength. A better known operatic femme fatale is, of course, Carmen from Bizet's 1875 opera. In her famous opening number, the Habanera, she warns prospective lovers about her fickle nature. If you don't love me, I love you. And if I love you, watch out. Prends garde à toi. I'll point out also that that aria, the Habanera, which I'm sure you know, is structured very similarly to Delilah's aria, with a repeated descending line with ample chromaticism. Again, to show her slippery nature as this femme fatale. Also, just as Delilah is set apart ethnically from Samson in that she's a foreigner, a Philistine, as opposed to an Israelite, that Samson's an Israelite, Carmen is orientalized as a Roma, more commonly referred to as a gypsy, which adds to her mystique for the main character, Don Jose. Carmen leads Don Jose down a bad path. Though she's eventually punished by her male aggressor, Don Jose jealously stabs her to death outside the bullfighting ring because she's left him for a bullfighter. Likewise, in Samson and Delilah, Samson summons what's left of his strength to pull down the Philistines' temple and crush his enemies, including the femme fatale Delilah. So you can see how these male fantasies of the exotic femme fatale have built into them a sense of retribution, that the men face the consequences of giving in to temptation. Their lives are ruined by the femme fatale character. But also, and rather misogynistically, they bring down these women with them. The femme fatale characters are also punished for their sins and destroyed by the men whom they corrupted. So we can detect some vestiges of the misogynistic femme fatale archetype in Moreau's paintings, as well as Huysmans' description of Moreau's paintings through his character Des Esseintes. Note, for example, that he projects his own sexual fantasies onto the painting when he writes, "Her breasts rise and fall, the nipples hardening at the touch of her whirling necklaces." In fact, her breasts aren't even visible in Moreau's earlier Salome painting that Des Esseintes is describing here. Her right arm is holding the lotus blossom and covers her chest. Again, this is the male imagination erotically filling out the story in a symbolist manner. Dancing harem concubines or slave girls were definitely a sexual fantasy in the 19th century, and they feature in ballets or dance sequences within Orientalist-themed operas. The fact that we're told in the Gospel of Matthew that Salome dances, combined with her status as a mildly exotic, she comes from the vague Near East and from some distant past, that makes her the perfect candidate to portray in the style of an exotic belly dancer. Yet this kind of proto-symbolist lack of detail in the original biblical story could also lead us down some darker paths if we reflect on it for too long. There's something so irresistible about Salome's skills at dancing that Herod swears an oath that he can't go back on. On the one hand, that might get your blood pumping. What kind of dance would be so sexy that it would lead a king to make such an unbreakable promise? But that's just the surface fantasy, the belly dancer surface. As Des Esseintes tells us, the Salome story is, quote, beyond the reach of punctilious pedestrian minds and accessible only to brains shaken and sharpened and rendered almost clairvoyant by neurosis. Neurosis, that is a psychological disorder like anxiety, obsession, compulsion, or phobia. Obviously, there are conditions that we're more sensitive to in the present day. But in this context, Des Esseintes means that the Salome tale appeals to a disturbed mind that can pick up on the more sinister elements. This is someone who looks beneath the sexy yet superficial harem girl scenario to see the deeper implications of this tale. For instance, what does Herod's request for a dance and his irrevocable contract with Salome, what do those say about the relationship between the stepfather and stepdaughter? We might overlook Herod's marriage to his former sister-in-law, but there's still something uncomfortable, both by today's standards and the standards of first century Jewish law, about a stepdaughter performing in such a manner for her stepfather. Then there's the nature of Salome's demand itself. Not just that John be executed, but specifically be beheaded. And then not simply that he be beheaded, but that his severed head be presented to her on a dish, a charger, as the Bible calls it, as if it were an extravagantly arranged course in the Tetrarch's birthday dinner, or some wondrous treasure being gifted to her. What kind of mind would invent such a request? I'll remind you that Matthew tells us that it's Salome's mother, Herodias, who makes this request through her daughter. This is her revenge for the terrible things that John the Baptist has said about her. We have to imagine those things too. But the question also remains about what happens once Salome is given the head. Does she give it to her mother? Does she keep it for herself? And if so, what exactly does she do with it when she keeps it? Does she treat it like a trophy and put it on display? or something much, much worse? Through these symbolist musings, we're starting to slip into a shadowy nether region, a new territory that Baudelaire had penetrated in his poetry collection Les Fleurs du Mal, The Flowers of Evil. I briefly mentioned it during our Afternoon of the Faun lecture. Recall that the poems in this collection touch on themes of homoeroticism, sadism, even Satanism. These were obviously taboo subjects for the 19th century, and its collection had to be censored, the three lesbian poems I mentioned. What Baudelaire started is carried even further by Huysmans in A Rebours. And it should come as no surprise that his character, Des Esseintes, admires the poetry of Baudelaire. What Huysmans established in A Rebours is a new strain of symbolism that came to be referred to as decadence. Now, you might have heard that word in jewelry ads or fashion magazines or Swarovski crystal kiosk at the mall. It's always alongside glittering words like glamour, opulence, extravagance, luxury, elegance. So you might assume it's synonymous, or at least close in meaning, to those fancy nouns. In reality, the word decadence stems from decay, that is, to rot or to decompose. That term decadence is usually applied to periods in history that are marked by moral and social decay, a loss of strong values, an abandonment of religious faith, and a breakdown in reliable institutions like the family or governing bodies. It most often refers to the decline of the Roman Empire, which accelerated around the 3rd century AD. In the late 19th century, the Roman Empire of Christ's time and onward was viewed as a period of political corruption, sexual permissiveness with lots of orgies going on, weakness in leadership, and a breakdown of gender roles. These became the markers of decadence. Of course, on the surface, these aspects have a kind of naughty appeal to them. Those in decadent societies are concerned with superficial beauty and displays of wealth, rather than with questions of character and morality. This is why the word is morphed into a synonym for glamour. But we always have to remember that this decadent glamour conceals a darker moral and social decay, at least from the perspective of late 19th and early 20th and the early 20th centuries. Of course, by today's standards, we have reevaluated what was once seen as a decadent taboo, and we've become more accepting of some practices that were deemed perverse. But within the context of bourgeois morality of turn of the century Europe, the decadent strain of symbolism embraces what was considered perverse or disturbing at the time. Their model was someone I'm sure many of you will know, the early 19th century American author Edgar Allan Poe, whose tales of the strange and macabre give a glimpse into the murkier corners of human nature. As a side note, you'll be interested to know that Debussy started sketching an opera based on Poe's short story, The Fall of the House of Usher, which is a very proto-symbolist and proto-decadent tale in that it depicts an incestuous aristocratic family whose ancestral home literally decays and collapses on them. Des Esseintes in A Rebours is a fan of Poe, and The Fall of the House of Usher is exactly the kind of wicked phantasmagoria that would appeal to his dark mind. But it's nothing compared to the perverse pleasure that Des Esseintes gets from contemplating the figure of Salome and projecting his dark fantasies onto Moreau's painting. As a figure of decadence, Salome goes so far beyond the femme fatale archetype. Carmen is simply a bad girl. She's promiscuous, participates in some smuggling, and she gets into some fights with her co-workers at the cigarette factory that she works at. These aspects give her exotic beauty a dangerous edge and make her more appealing. Salome isn't a comparable sexual fantasy cloaked in exoticism and mild debauchery. For the decadent movement, Salome's acts are less a source of femme fatale titillation than an object of glorification in themselves. Decadent artists wallow in and take pleasure in her perversity. They find beauty in her vile actions, especially the fact that she doesn't merely commit murder, but that the means of execution, which again her mother invents, but Salome requests from Herod, the means of execution is elevated to a kind of art form. John the Baptist's head is placed on a platter like a statue. One with decadent tastes will appreciate the sickening beauty in such a display, the kind of ultimate work of art of the human form transformed into an inert sculpture. There's a comparable image in Huysmans' A Rebours that I'd like us to keep in mind as a metaphor for decadence as we continue our discussion. Des Esseintes has a pet tortoise, and he has its shell encrusted with jewels. But one day, he finds that the poor reptile is inert on one of his home's sumptuous rugs. Huysmans writes, "It had not been able to bear the dazzling luxury imposed upon it, the glittering cape in which it had been clad, the precious stones which had been used to decorate its skull." Again, it's a dead thing like John the Baptist's head that's objectified, turned into a piece of jewelry or an expensive knickknack. But perhaps the tortoise might also remind us of Moreau's Salome, of the woman herself, dripping with jewels. That Salome, in the imagination of the decadent movement, is herself a glittering and bejeweled object of beauty that's morally dead on the inside. So with these intoxicatingly horrifying images of severed heads and bejeweled tortoises stamped in our minds, we can turn our attention now to Huysmans' spiritual successor in the decadence movement, Irish playwright Oscar Wilde. Many of you might be surprised to hear me mutter Wilde in the same breath as intoxicatingly horrifying, especially if you know him from his lighthearted parlor room comedies like The Importance of Being Earnest. And yet, as an openly gay man, this darker side of symbolism would have naturally appealed to Wilde, as he himself flouted convention and engaged in sexual acts that were deemed taboo in Victorian Britain. He was actually tried in 1895 for what was termed sodomy at the time, and was imprisoned for his relationships with young men and male prostitutes. Wilde's Salome play is something of a tribute to Moreau's paintings and Huysmans' literary immortalization of those paintings in his novel. In fact, in Wilde's other famous decadent work, his novel The Picture of Dorian Gray, the titular protagonist becomes obsessed with Huysmans' A Rebours and patterns his life after it. Wilde actually wrote his play in French in 1891, which makes sense as symbolism and decadence emerged out of French poetry and painting. Wilde, wanting to escape the burden of fame in London, he was quite the celebrity, and you should read some of his very biting comments about other celebrities and about his little quips about life in general. So Wilde had relocated to Paris, where he hobnobbed with the likes of Mallarmé. The play was translated from French into English 3 years later and was supposed to premiere in London, but it was denied a production by the Lord Chamberlain of Britain. That's an officer in the royal household who has the power to grant or deny licenses for performances. There was a law at the time banning all theatrical works depicting biblical figures. So not only Wilde's Salome got the axe, but also Saint-Saëns' Samson and Delilah. So the language of Salome, especially in its original French, is in large part indebted to Maeterlinck, though it would be indebted to his pre-Pelléas plays, since Pelléas and Melisande didn't premiere until 1983, which is 2 years after Wilde had written Salome. But like Maeterlinck, the dialogue is simple and almost childlike, arguably more so than in Maeterlinck's, especially since Wilde employs blatant dramatic and textual repetition. You may have noticed from listening to Strauss's operatic adaptation, even in its German translation, that events happen in groups of three, as you can see there. Salome demands 3 times that Naraboth, the captain of the guard, bring up John the Baptist from his subterranean prison. By the way, Wilde refers to John in the play as Jochanan, which is derived from the original Hebrew name Yochanan. Once Jochanan is brought up, Salome admires 3 aspects of his person: his pale body, his black hair, and his red mouth, before sending him back when he refuses to kiss her. Herod leaves his birthday party to track down his stepdaughter, whom he's been staring at all night. Once he finds her, he offers her 3 comforts: wine, fruit, and a throne. You can remember she says, "I'm not thirsty, Tetrarch, I'm not hungry, Tetrarch, and I'm not tired, Tetrarch." Once she's danced and made the horrible demand of Yochanan's head, Herod tries to dissuade Salome by making 3 alternative offers: an emerald, his peacocks, and the 3rd most desperate offer, an even longer list of jewels than just an emerald, as well as the mantle of the high priest and the curtain in the temple, one of the most holy objects in Judaism at the time, as it separated the part of the temple called the Holy of Holies, where the presence of God was. To give that curtain to someone would be blasphemy in the highest degree. Shows you how desperate Herod is at this moment. So these tripartite episodes follow an old storytelling technique called the rule of 3s. You've no doubt seen demonstrated in fairy tales like the 3 Little Pigs or Goldilocks and the 3 Bears. This is the idea that there's a natural balance and variety when things happen in 3s during a story. It won't come as a surprise that Wilde himself penned some fairy tales, and his use of that effect in this play grants his Salome the appearance of a myth or a storybook. He packages it in the guise of children's literature, which only exacerbates the decadent shock when we realize that this is not the kind of fairy tale that you're going to read to the kiddies before bed. So these groups of 3 also afford an opportunity for Wilde to engage in his purposefully excessive stretches of description and metaphor. Wilde's prose is analogous to the intricate architectural detail of Moreau's Salome painting. In fact, that long list of jewels that Wilde's Herod offers to Salome in his last-ditch effort will remind you of both the image of jewels adorning Moreau's Salome, as well as Des Esseintes' meticulous catalog of all these jewels that he gives us in Huysmans' A Rebours. There are some fantastic symbolist metaphors in this speech from Herod as he rattles off the gems in his collection. He says, "I have a collar of pearls, like 50 moons caught in a golden net. Opals that make sad men's minds." That is, they make men's minds sad. He uses a very old-fashioned order of words. Opals that make sad men's minds and are fearful of the shadows. Onyxes like the eyeballs of dead women. A little bit of foreshadowing there. So there's a strange balance between the compact sentence structure yet flamboyant language in Wilde's play. Wilde's brand of symbolism follows the restrained syntax of Maeterlinck, but his symbols are nothing like the unadorned rings and crowns of Mallarmé, just simple gold circles. In true decadent fashion, the symbols and descriptions of Wilde are fanciful, over the top, sparkling, and verging on the grotesque in their excessive abundance. Yet they still retain a sense of symbolist mystery in Wilde's rather ambiguously metaphorical language. Let's take a look at this exchange between Salome and Naraboth, that is the captain of the guard. It's the first big rule of 3s episode in the play. See how the repetition of variations on the phrase, "You will do this for me, Naraboth," that provides this kind of storytelling structure. But then look how poetic Salome's promises become, how she promises to drop a token of her gratitude in this delicious, repetitive little phrase, "A little flower, a little green flower." The addition of that adjective green would seem to make this more specific, but actually, in the spirit of symbolism, it makes it even more mysterious. Why green? Why not red? So descriptive might not be the right word for Wilde's language, since description signifies specificity and directness, the opposite of symbolism. The vividness of Wilde's language merely intensifies the mystery. So it's this very strange paradox, I think. By the way, if we do want to find some secret meaning, here's a possible one. The green carnations were worn by Wilde and his gay friends as secret signs of their homosexuality. It might help to explain this phrase, or it may merely multiply its layers of meanings in a very symbolist manner. On the next page, on the right here, Salome orientalizes herself as a kind of harem girl, peering at Naraboth behind a muslin veil. He will only be able to imagine her smiling. And it's this irresistible image, though one that will be unseen to him, that finally wins him over. Certainly Wilde, in spite of his homosexuality, is playing into the Orientalist trope of Salome as an exotic beauty, especially with the dance that he has her perform, which he titles The Dance of the Seven Veils. Wilde doesn't explain the choreography, leaving that up to the director, but traditionally, the actress, or later the singer in the case of the opera, though I should also mention sometimes there's a body double if the singer or actress doesn't feel comfortable performing that. So traditionally, the singer or actress or body double will don 7 diaphanous veils that she lets drop one by one over the course of the dance. She's either left totally nude or in some skimpy little number. This is obviously a kind of belly dancer striptease fantasy inspired by popular European theatrical entertainments of the time that depicted the Middle East, or their idea of the Middle East. But even though Wilde indulges in these tropes of Orientalism, what sets his Salome apart as a decadent subject and not merely an objectified femme fatale is the fact that she calls the shots in this play. Granted, we should remember that like Bizet's Carmen or Saint-Saëns' Delilah, Salome is punished through her death. But the fact that this punishment, this death, is kind of tacked on like an afterthought, and say in Salome, at the very last moment of the drama, might be a sign that Wilde is reluctantly submitting to the moralistic expectations of Victorian audiences, who want to see Salome's sexual excess contained. But for 99% of the play, Salome is in complete control of her sexuality. What makes Salome's eroticism appealing from a decadent perspective is the fact that she is simultaneously sexual and chaste. That is, she's a virgin. She's aware of her beauty and her effect on men, and she uses this power to manipulate the men around her, but withholds herself from actually submitting to their sexual advances. Now, this plays into all sorts of other female stereotypes, like the Ice Queen. But within the context of late 19th century Europe, there's something very radical about this Salome who finds pleasure in withholding her potent sexuality from the men who would possess her. That is, with the exception of Jochanan, again, John the Baptist, who's the only man who doesn't stare at Salome. The prophet's lack of lust and his refusal to kiss Salome is precisely what sets the terrible course of events in motion. Salome can't accept that a man would deny her the desire she is due, and so she forces Jochanan to submit to her kiss by the only means possible. We should also pay attention to how Wilde has shifted the power dynamic in the mother-daughter relationship between Herodias and Salome. As I mentioned, many earlier artistic depictions of John the Baptist's beheading, some of them portrayed Herodias as the main instigator. These versions follow the biblical account, with Herodias as the one plotting in the background, and Salome as just the naive tool. Herodias, again, is insulted by John the Baptist's insults and wants to claim her revenge. So many operas, poems, and paintings from earlier in the 19th century and before had made her the central femme fatale figure. One of Wilde's most innovative alterations in his play was to resist, almost blasphemously, what it says in the Gospels and retell the story with Salome as its central agent. That's why that first encounter between Salome and Jochanan is so important. There needs to be a dramatic motivation for why she, Salome, and not Herodias, would want Jochanan killed. But this motivation is so disturbing precisely because it's not a revenge motivation, like Herodias's motivation. No, Salome doesn't want Jochanan killed to punish him, but so that she can possess him sexually, so that she can love him in some form, even if that means loving a corpse. The final monologue, in which Salome triumphantly kisses the head of her would-be lover, is the height of decadence. In synesthetic language, Wilde turns this moment into a beautifully erotic encounter akin to a Shakespearean love scene. He absolutely revels in her debauchery, but not through harsh, dirty, or disgusting language. Rather, Salome's speech retains the same bejeweled metaphors and evocative symbolist imagery as earlier in the play. Ah, I have kissed thy mouth, Jochanan. I have kissed thy mouth. There was a bitter taste on thy lips. Was it the taste of blood? But perchance it is the taste of love. They say that love has a bitter taste. While Herod, viewing from the sidelines, calls her monstrous and dubs what she's done a crime, we, as an audience, are encouraged by Salome herself not to be distracted by the death that's occurred, not to view this as a heinous murder, but to see it transformed into a pure moment of love between two people, one of whom just happens to be a severed head. Salome tells us which symbolist mystery to ponder in this strange scene. The mystery of love is greater than the mystery of death. Love only should one consider. So this defense of Salome's literal bloodlust isn't a particularly feminist alternative to the typical femme fatale, but at least it's a thrilling and thought-provoking perspective, one which you might want to address in your staging of Richard Strauss's Salome, or if you choose to choreograph his Dance of the Seven Veils. In addition, the moment where Salome is crushed under the shield undoes all the agency that Wilde endowed his heroine with, reducing her to a commonplace femme fatale to be punished like Carmen or Delilah. And that could also be a point to rework in your staging. But if Wilde wants us to rise up above right and wrong and embrace the aesthetic value in Salome's necrophiliac kiss, his illustrator Aubrey Beardsley wants to remind us of the true nature of her act. His black ink drawings, which were included in the 1894 English edition of the printed play, aren't exactly illustrations, since some depict Salome conducting activities that she never does in the play. We can think of them more as artistic responses to Wilde's text. With his attention to detail and penchant for extravagantly costumed figures, Beardsley approximates the bejeweled surface of Wilde's poetic decadence in many of his Salome drawings. Especially these two, they look like they could be costume designs for a production of Salome. And those of you interested in haute couture, or even in creating your own costumes for Salome, would be wise to look at Beardsley's illustrations as a starting point. By the way, I'll point out in The Black Cape, the illustration on the right, there are some very suggestive creases in the train of the cape and the fingers of Salome's left hand. All these rounded serpentine lines, which can verge on the pornographic, as you'll see if you zoom in, these are indebted to a turn-of-the-century movement in design and architecture called Art Nouveau, which valued the curves of nature, especially the forms of plants and birds. But amongst Beardsley's Art Nouveau tendrils, there are grotesque Byzantine reminders of what lies not just beneath the seven veils, that is, Salome's naked body, which Beardsley captures so seductively and curvaceously, but also the ugliness deep in the hearts of these despicable characters. The best assessment of these illustrations comes from Wilde himself, who likens Beardsley's style to absinthe, the green hallucinogenic liquor that we discussed last week, which was a favorite of the symbolists. So Wilde says, absinthe is to all other drinks what Aubrey's drawings are to other pictures. It has about it the seduction of strange sins. It is stronger than any other spirit and brings out the subconscious self in a man. It is just like your drawings, Aubrey. It gets on one's nerves and is cruel. We see this manifested in the depictions of Salome herself in Aubrey's illustration, in Beardsley's illustrations. I'm on first name basis, like Oscar. So Salome in Beardsley's illustrations is rendered as a beautiful monster. In this famous illustration I have here, she floats above the ground, a bit like Moreau's Salome, but her hair curls up snake-like, as if she were a Medusa. And there's something almost witch-like about her pointed chin and arched eyebrows. Indeed, while all the characters in the illustrations have strong and attractive facial features, but they're permanently fixed in sneers, smirks, and leers. What's more, Beardsley often features grotesque little gargoyles in the corners of his illustrations, like the two creepy little cupids here on the left, or the goblin lute player who accompanies Salome's dance on the right. Beardsley also features deformed characters, like this dwarf slave who holds the train of Herodias's robe. And he's balanced on her left with that homoerotic evocation of a young man. Or the most fascinating of all the illustrations on the right, the hermaphroditic demon on the title page with female breasts and male genitalia. That's a reference less to the play itself than to the goat-headed figure Baphomet from Satanism, who's depicted as a hermaphrodite. I have a feeling this is a kind of decadent representation of the spirit of evil that runs through this play, that this is the God that these characters worship with their deeds, as opposed to the God that John the Baptist worships. Now, of course, we largely object today to depicting disabled, deformed, or non-binary people as monsters in such a manner, the way Beardsley takes perverse pleasure in the malformities or in non-normative bodies. Which brings us to this illustration, which I wanted to call your attention to. Wilde specifies that the executioner, whose name is Naaman, is black. We're told that he has no fear or qualms about carrying out the tetrarch's death sentences, though we learn this from the side characters in the play. Naaman himself isn't given a chance to speak in the drama. In the scene where he beheads Jochanan, the executioner's body becomes something of a prop. The stage directions say that a huge black arm comes forth from the cistern, bearing on a silver shield the head of Jochanan. And you can see how Beardsley runs with this objectification of Naaman's limb, which becomes like an ebony column propping up the platter on which John's head lies. We only know it's a human from the few little kinky hairs that come out of his forearm and the small white lines that define his musculature. Otherwise, it's the leg of a table. So I pose a challenge to you as a possible approach for your final project. How might a production of Strauss's opera rehabilitate Naaman and involve him as more than just a black accessory to the drama? Again, he's treated as a living, breathing guillotine or a table. But how might you, as a director, endow him with humanity and agency through your production? So while we haven't explicitly addressed Richard Strauss's operatic adaptation of Wilde's Salome, everything we've been discussing thus far will help to illuminate your understanding of the opera, which is why I've gone to such lengths to lay out the biblical origins of the story, its reception in the arts, its special influence on symbolism and the symbolist offshoot of decadence, a movement spearheaded by the French author Huysmans and his literary responses to the paintings of Moreau. And finally, the ultimate Salome incarnation of Wilde's play, so perfectly yet disturbingly captured in Aubrey Beardsley's illustrations. Now, the creators we've been discussing so far have been primarily based in Paris or London, though in Wilde's case, he was an Irishman who had relocated from London to Paris, where he wrote Salome in French. Strauss, however, was German, and so outside this French-English decadent milieu. Though I'll point out that in Vienna, which is in Austria, not Germany, though Strauss would later become associated with Vienna once he became director of the Vienna State Opera. So in Vienna, there was a distinctly Austrian equivalent of decadence and symbolism emerging that was linked to the collective of artists called the Vienna Secession. We can't get too deeply into this movement today, but I'll point out that they explored similar themes and techniques as the French and English symbolists, especially their heavy use of decorative details, which might remind us of Moreau's architecture and jewels, or all the curvy Art Nouveau designs of Beardsley's illustrations. So these two images aren't of Salome, even though they seem to be. Rather, they depict a similar biblical femme fatale named Judith, who was a Jewish woman who defends her city from the Assyrians by seducing their general and then cutting off his head. But you can see how similar they are to Beardsley's illustrations of Salome. The full exposed breasts, the luxurious and ornate costumes, and the sneering expressions on Judith's face. This artist, Gustav Klimt, is probably very familiar to you, especially his famous gold-leafed painting, The Kiss. And in fact, we know that Strauss was familiar with Klimt and regarded Klimt's paintings as a kind of visual analog to his music. In the world of this painter of fantasy, Strauss said he had found, quote, much of my own music, especially in Salome. So these works by Klimt will start to give you some idea of Strauss's very decadent musical style. But I should point out that while Strauss would become synonymous with the genre of opera, at the point that he composed Salome in 1905, he only had two rather lackluster operatic works under his belt. Strauss, though, was nevertheless internationally famous at the turn of the century for his skills as a conductor and for his compositions in another musical genre, the tone poem. I briefly touched on the tone poem in our lecture on The Afternoon of a Faun when I emphasized that Debussy's piece wasn't a tone poem. That is, it wasn't a piece that was trying to musically represent the plot and images of Mallarmé's poem, but to convey the mood or atmosphere, Debussy's general impression of Mallarmé's poem. Now, Strauss, in his tone poems, was trying to translate events, characters, and settings into music. They're typically based on literary works, but sometimes he formulated his own autobiographical or semi-autobiographical scenarios. I've listed the tone poems he composed before Salome, as well as their subjects or literary sources. Though you shouldn't think of them as akin to film scores, as if their music perfectly lined up with an imaginary fantasia sequence. The scenario being depicted in a tone poem, which is called its program, is never very detailed. Even if the tone poem is inspired by a literary poem or a novel or a play, we only get a general idea of the plot and characters in Strauss's music, not a slavish attempt to sonically depict each and every moment. But more so than in Debussy's Afternoon of the Faun, Strauss, in his tone poems, has a definite goal of storytelling through music, albeit with the clearly defined structure of a symphonic work that could function as a piece of music that you can enjoy independently of the program, that is, independently of the scenario. So we can think of these works as somewhere between the pure sonic expression of a symphony and the accompanimental or pictorial function of film music. Here is an interesting list of some little-known tone poems that I dug up. In reality, this is your attendance link. So what I've done here is invented some tone poems by 4 made-up composers, and I've listed them here, and it's an acrostic, which is you read the first letter of each title, and if you read them downwards, you'll see the list of letters and numbers to plug in for your link this week. So I'll go through them for those of you who might be hard of seeing. Again, it always starts off with https://forms.gle/ and then read down the acrostic and fill that in. And I've put in bold the lowercase letters so you don't confuse them, and make sure you put them in lowercase. And there's 2 numbers there, the 7s, that you should put as digits. So here we go. Capital L as in La Pasta Incantata, or the enchanted pasta. Capital P as in Percolate and Trepida. Lowercase j as in Juniper Grove. Uppercase P as in Prinzessin Puderquaste. A Puderquaste in German is a powder puff for makeup. Lowercase o as in Ondine et les Elfes. Lowercase I as in Il Piccolo Porcaio. A porcaio is a swineherd. 7, the number 7, as in 7 days in the life of a porcupine. Lowercase r as in Re Cornelio e sua suocera. That's King Cornelius and his mother-in-law. Capital L as in Les Femmes de la Crème. Lowercase t as in the abduction of Engorgida. Lowercase u as in Une fille peut rêver, which means a girl can dream. Capital N as in Neun Leben für eine Katze, or 9 lives for a cat. Capital E as in Enrico Barone di Baviera, Henry, Baron of Bavaria. Capital V as in von Liebe und Steuererklärungen, which means of love and tax returns. Lowercase s as in Schuhe, Schiffe und Siegellack. That means, if you're a fan of Lewis Carroll, that's shoes, ships, and sealing wax. Lowercase p as in Pampalina, or who makes merry this early. And then the number 7 as in 7 Deadly Annoyances by Bosky Lloyd Stevenson, that great English composer of tone poems. So let's do this one more time. I won't go through the titles this time. Again, it's https://, so I think you can drop that. Then the word forms, then dot, GLE, as in the last 3 letters of Google, /, and then capital L, as in la, capital P, as in percolate, lowercase j, as in juniper, capital P, as in princess, lowercase o, as in Oswald, lowercase I, as in iodine, the number 7, lowercase r, as in Richard, uppercase L, as in Larry, lowercase t, as in Tanya, lowercase u, as in umbrella, uppercase N, as in Nancy, uppercase E, as in Edward, uppercase V, as in Victoria, lowercase s, as in shoe, lowercase p, as in pumpkin, and the number 7. And that concludes our overview of some little-known tone poems. You can check them out on Spotify. So returning to a real tone poem by Strauss, a good example that we should listen to is the opening of his best-loved tone poem, Also sprach Zarathustra, which means thus spake or thus spoke Zarathustra, which is based on the 1892 philosophical novel of Friedrich Nietzsche, a very, very, very important novel for modernist artists. So in the prologue to his novel, Nietzsche's prophet Zarathustra greets the sun and praises the warmth and light it provides. And I give you a little quotation there. Strauss translates this moment into a blinding sonic evocation of a sunrise in the first movement of his tone poem based on Zarathustra. So it opens with this drone in the bass drum, organ, double basses, and contrabassoons. That's like a larger version of a bassoon, which gives us an image of darkness and a flat horizon. Then we suddenly see the very top of the sun coming up in the form of a rising melody played piano by the trumpet. And once enough of the sun has risen, the orchestra bursts out in a blaring forte outbursts of C minor, punctuated by those iconic timpani beats, bum, 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 bum. We might hear this as the rays of the sun shining forth. Stanley Kubrick, of course, in his film 2001: A Space Odyssey, paired a literal visual depiction of a sunrise. But I think that a listener who didn't know that this depicted a sunrise might still be able to guess it from just the musical metaphors alone. Now, even though Strauss had very little experience with opera at the time he wrote Salome, he nevertheless had developed a very vivid pictorial style in his music, which he had fine-tuned over the 9 tone poems he composed up until that point. This pictorialism, as we'll see, transferred marvelously to a theatrical setting, where Strauss's music could reinforce what was happening on stage, or more importantly, even tell us what's happening off stage. Indeed, Salome offers 3 big opportunities for Strauss to produce miniature tone poems when there are long pauses in the action that involve Jokanan and his cistern, the well that he's kept in as a prisoner. One, again, a group of 3. One, there's the passage where Jokanan is brought up to see Salome. Then there's the passage after he rejects her and he's brought back down. And then there's the passage where Naaman, the executioner, goes down into the cistern to behead Jokanan, and then bring his head back up. So from the third of these tone poem-like passages, I want to excerpt a fantastic little detail that's very famous, but I'll explain now how it is very unusual for Strauss's style. In fact, it's rather close to Debussy in Pelléas and Melisande, as we'll see. This is the part where Salome is straining to hear Naaman carry out the execution, but all she hears is silence. Strauss, like Debussy, gives an incredible musical depiction of silence with just a barely perceptible violin tremolo, played pianissimo, very quiet. You can make it out in this recording, but you'll likely mistake it for just background white noise. You can't really tell it's a violin tremolo. Then we hear something, this creepy whimper-like pitch. If you didn't have a score in hand, you'd never guess that this is the double bass, the lowest instrument in the orchestra. And that's because it's playing so high in its range that you'd never guess it's a bass. So we have here a very symbolist treatment of the orchestra, as in Debussy. Strauss just gives the suggestion of sound and forces the audience, like Salome, to fill in the blanks of what's happening. When we do get a sound, that little whimper, it's not clear if it's connected with whatever unspeakable act is taking place down in that dark cistern. And on top of that dramatic ambiguity, it's not even clear what the sound is in the first place. That is, which string instrument is playing, or even if it is a string instrument, you might mistake it for a woodwind. But this is the quietest the music gets. On the whole, Strauss's aesthetic is the polar opposite of Debussy's. You can see how they overlap in their symbolist treatment of the orchestra and their depictions of silence or near silence. Strauss is much closer to Wagner than Debussy, and we'll see at the end of this lecture how he employs Wagner's leitmotivic system. With Strauss's orchestral and vocal writing is like Wagner on cocaine. The sheer density of Strauss's score in Salome is comparable to all those glittering details in decadent art. The layers of jewels that plate Moreau's Salome like body armor, the gilded mosaic patterns that make up the clothing on Klimt's figures, or the Art Nouveau tendrils and bulbous petal or feather motifs that fill in the backgrounds of Beardsley's illustrations. And of course, the lengthy flights of poetic fancy in Wilde's original text, those endless stretches where characters rattle off strings of wondrous verbal images. On the subject of text, I'll point out that obviously Strauss is using a German text, but it's a translation of the original Wilde by an author named Hedwig Lachmann. Strauss saw a production of the play in 1902, which used Lachmann's translation. And like Debussy and Maeterlinck, Strauss left most of the text unchanged, even though it wasn't in the original French or English translation. He cut quite a bit, but as you'd imagine from such a verbose author like Wilde, there's quite a bit of fat in this play that could be trimmed. So like Debussy, Strauss really tightened the drama through these cuts. There were also some minor rearrangements of words to make the syntax more compact. But overall, it's faithful to the original play, with none of the versification I mentioned, which was common in earlier librettos of the 19th century and earlier. By the way, you may sometimes hear this process of setting the unaltered text or just minorly altered text. You might hear this referred to as Literaturopera or literature opera in English. The German is Literaturoper. That is when a composer respects the original text of a spoken drama and only makes minor edits. It became especially common in the early 20th century, beginning with works like Salome or Pelléas. But returning to Wilde's flowery, perfumed language, it's precisely this feature of the original play dialogue that served as the main poetic impetus for Strauss's music in his operatic adaptation. Strauss's score, and especially the accompanimental writing, is like an orchestral tapestry that responds to each and every metaphor and adjective. This is a compositional technique termed text painting or word painting. A composer will attempt to paint an image through musical metaphor. A very simple example of such a metaphor would be the rising trumpet line that we heard in Also sprach Zarathustra, which we associate with something ascending. But text painting usually occurs in works of music that have a chorus or soloists who are singing a text. The composer then can try to give a musical impression, either in the vocal line or in the accompaniment, usually a piano accompaniment or an orchestral accompaniment. The composers Handel and Schubert were the masters of word painting, but they're typically restrained and mostly tasteful in how they employ this technique. Strauss is not restrained and sometimes not very tasteful. He purposefully overloads us with sonic images to give a musical approximation of the poetic images, this overabundance of poetic images that Wilde bombards us with in the text. Since we keep returning to Salome's jewels, which is such a potent symbol for the glittering surface of decadence that hides the moral rot beneath, let's listen to Strauss's Herod, or he gives him the German name Herodes. So Strauss's Herod, let's listen to him rattle off the catalog of gems that he offers to Salome on his third attempt to dissuade her from demanding the head of Jokanan.
Ich habe an diesem Ort Juwelen versteckt, Juwelen, die selbst seine Mutter nie gesehen hat. Ich habe ein Halsband mit 4 Reihen Perlen. Topase, gelb wie die Augen der Tiger. Topase, hellrot wie die Augen der Waldtaube. Grüne Topase wie Katzenaugen. Ich habe Opale, die immer funkeln, mit einem Feuer alt wie Eis.
the piano reduction in the clip I showed, again, a piano reduction is when you take the orchestral score and for purposes of studying the work or learning the work if you're a singer, or rehearsing the work. You'll have a piano accompanist. Obviously, you can't have the full orchestra to rehearse the work, and so you'll have a pianist who plays this piano reduction in something called a piano vocal score, which is what I'm showing excerpts from. And obviously, that piano reduction could never do justice to the treasure box orchestration that Strauss gives us here in this passage, which features a glockenspiel. Remember, a kind of xylophone, but with metal slats. A pizzicato strings that is plucked, harp, and celesta, which is an instrument we'll revisit in a moment. On top of this sparkling and glimmering collection of instruments, the flutes execute trills and arpeggios. Arpeggios are you go up and down a chord, da 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 da. The flutes execute these trills and arpeggios that give the impression of a soft glow emanating from these sonic gemstones. Just as Strauss felt compelled to translate text into music, one, as in me, one is tempted to return Strauss's music into equally vivid language. This is that same synesthetic impulse of symbolism that we detected last week when we discussed Pelléas and Melisande. But it's no longer the subtle changes of light that's being evoked here, but some cave of wonders jam-packed with strange and beautiful objects. Indeed, Strauss's incessant word painting, his hundreds of little musical responses to each and every poetic image in the text, this often verges on sonic overload, akin to the visual overload of some of the Beardsley illustrations. Remember what Wilde said about Beardsley's style, how it gets on one's nerves and is cruel. And the same can easily be applied to Strauss's Salome score. There are definitely moments when Strauss intentionally irritates us, not just in the density of the word painting, but also in the sheer volume of this opera, which is so dang loud. There's a huge orchestra in the pit, sometimes even spilling out if the pit's a small pit. And you'll notice at times on the recording that I've provided on our course website, how it even swallows up the singers. The role of Salome is an absolute beast to sing, and it demands a very special heavyweight voice, a soprano who can project over this giant orchestra and carry most of this opera on her back, or rather on her lungs, for an hour and a half. Over an hour and a half, I think it's an hour and 40. Wagner was the first to make such demands on his singers. And the same singers who tackle Salome also perform the mythical Wonder Women, the roles of Brunhilde in the Ring Cycle and Isolde in Tristan and Isolde. The soprano Birgit Nilsson, who's featured on the recording I gave you on our course website, is one of the best representatives of this superhuman voice type, which is sometimes referred to as a Wagnerian soprano, or more broadly, a dramatic soprano. So this soprano, this Wonder Woman soprano, Nilsson or whoever who is portraying Salome, she and her colleagues have to compete with some utterly ghastly orchestral motives that verge on pure noise. These are purposefully ugly and serve the same function as those horrible little imps or those poor misshapen jesters in the corners of Beardsley's ink illustrations, or the scowls and sneers that are plastered on the faces of Beardsley and Klimt's otherwise attractive figures. My favorite example is when Herodias, remember Herod's wife, Herod's second wife and Salome's stepmother, when Herodias makes fun of Herod for offering peacocks of all things to Salome to dissuade her from the head. There is this deafening squawking produced in the very shrill upper reaches of the clarinets and paired with a trumpet in its own piercing top notes to make sure that this really grates on the ears. But don't worry about following along in the vocal score for this next clip, even though I provide it. Just listen for this sound. You won't miss it, which imitates both the cry of a peacock and the wheezing guffaw of somebody mockingly laughing at Herod for his stupid avian offer. By the way, I don't think it's included in the opera. I recently watched a film version of Salome, and at first Herod offers her only half of his peacocks. He says, I have 100, I'll give you 50 peacocks, half my peacocks. And then after a second, he goes, I'll give you all the peacocks. And I think that's hilarious that he wasn't willing to give up all the peacocks at some point. He only 50. So Herod, by the way, as you could probably tell, is often the butt of jokes, both Wilde's jokes and Strauss's musical jokes, like this guffawing peacock sound. You'll also hear it in his cartoonish vocal line, which is very parlando, but not the boring, static, monotone parlando of Pelléas, but rather this cartoonish up and down. In fact, there are parts in this recording that we hear where the singer breaks out into full speech, just approximating the pitches. He's a buffoon character and the source of the comic relief in the opera. It's one of my favorite roles in opera. I think it's hilarious. So he's the most musically chaotic and grotesque of the characters. Unfortunately, just as we saw how Beardsley tended to apply the concept of the grotesque and the monstrous to misshapen or even black bodies, Strauss commits a rather anti-Semitic application of musical grotesquerie in his setting of the Jews' argument. This is one of the loudest passages in the score, with the Jewish guests at Herod's party bickering about religious matters. They sing over one another at fortissimo and high in their respective registers, which will create a very nasal quality to their voices. These were very common stereotypes of Jews, as loud, argumentative, and nasal in their voice, nasally voiced. We have here an artistic incarnation of the kind of casual anti-Semitism that was widespread in Strauss's day. And of course, we know the horrible consequences of that. And on that subject, it certainly doesn't help that Strauss, though not exactly sympathetic with the Nazis, I think it was his daughter-in-law who was Jewish, he at least cooperated with them to the point that he was given a prominent musical positions within the Third Reich. Since that side of Strauss takes us beyond the compositional period of Salome, we'll have to leave that topic alone for now. But as a suggestion for a possible final project, you might want to rehabilitate or critique Salome by exploring themes of Jewish identity in your production. Before we move on, I will add that balancing these uglier passages, which are even hatefully ugly at times, are moments of supreme delicacy. Just as Beardsley and Klimt balance the extremes of beauty and ugliness in their works. As we turn our discussion now to Salome herself, the character in Strauss's opera, I'll point out one of my favorite passages of sheer instrumental splendor, which is the music that greets the princess when she leaves the stifling interior of Herod's palace and remarks how sweet the air is outside. We get this lovely little passage where Strauss pairs tremolo violins and the instrument I mentioned before, the celesta, sometimes called the celeste. It's a keyboard, but so you play a keyboard just like a piano keyboard, but instead of hammers that strike strings like you see in a piano, the hammers strike little pieces of metal, like on a glockenspiel, kind of like that, that reverberate like tiny little bells. You'll know it from Tchaikovsky's Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy. And Strauss no doubt wants us to transfer this fairy association to Salome herself. The shimmering texture that it creates is also evocative of moonlight. And you'll notice how, in a very symbolist manner, Salome, in Wilde's original text, is associated with the moon. Since she's beautiful, pale, and chaste, the moon is often associated with virginity. So Strauss's music here is an evocation of Salome's pale and beautiful exterior, or the ropes of pearls and diamonds that might adorn her. But the composer isn't as superficial as I may be leading you to believe. This is just the jewel-encrusted exterior of the dead tortoise. To conclude today, let's take a glimpse into Salome's dark psyche via Strauss's revolutionary use of leitmotifs, and one unnerving leitmotif in particular. So I briefly mentioned the Wagnerian qualities of Strauss's style, how he's more explicitly indebted to Wagner than Debussy was. This includes, of course, Strauss's use of a leitmotivic system. And the one that he lays out in this opera is not only incredibly sophisticated, but also genuinely memorable. These leitmotifs are tailor-made for the characters and really stick with you as a listener. Though part of their memorability is no doubt because the score is hyper-saturated with leitmotifs in the excessive spirit of decadence that pervades in Strauss's Salome. By way of an example, I'll play for you Jochanan's leitmotif here. So it's very solemn and hymn-like, but also muscular and almost heroic, all qualities that suit this pious man of God who lives out in the desert and eats wild locusts and honey, as the Bible tells us. It's a no-nonsense kind of leitmotif. When we hear it accompany the prophet when he is presented to Salome, Strauss sets it in C major, a pure and unadorned key. There's also no dotted or triplet rhythms, just a very four-square rhythm with the same falling interval repeated progressively higher, so that the leitmotif traces a big ascent overall. This gives the impression of something rising up, like Strauss's sunrise melody in Zarathustra. We could associate this with the sound of Jochanan's booming voice rising up from the cistern as he prophesies, or with the fact that he, and later his head, are brought up from the prison. But there's also the spiritual association in that Jochanan is concerned with higher things that aren't of this earthly realm, that his thoughts and his words are directed upward to heaven. Salome has a whole constellation of leitmotifs associated with her, and we can see in a couple of them how Strauss characterizes her and differentiates her from Jochanan. Hers is the first leitmotif that we hear. In fact, the first music that we hear, period, in the opera. This opening clarinet run of Salome's first leitmotif is the polar opposite of Jochanan's slow, plodding hymn. It's slinking, sensual, and serpentine. After the held pitch at the top of the run, it makes a final little flirtatious gesture, like a little musical wink or a drop of the shoulder, which features a dotted rhythm. This is Salome's girlish and effervescent side, the charmingly seductive princess we see on the surface. But there's also something off about her, or at least Strauss tells us that there's something off about her in the second leitmotif that's associated with Salome. Though irresistible, the princess also inspires a sense of uneasiness for the characters who are in her presence. Both the page boy and Herod remark that they feel like something terrible is going to happen. And that anxiety takes musical form in many extended trills that you hear throughout the opera. Now, a trill is a very quick oscillation between two notes, typically a whole or a half step apart. That might sound familiar. I said that Debussy used oscillating half and whole steps to represent darkness in Pelléas, but his oscillations are much too slow to be counted as trills. Trills are very rapid and create a sense of expectation. They're often ornaments that prepare us for the final note of a long and virtuosic solo passage in a voice or instrumental solo. But Strauss drags them on endlessly. We keep expecting to arrive at some kind of goal, but we never do. And so we're left feeling on edge. So Salome's second main leitmotif is very often paired with the trill. You can see the trill in the flute, clarinet, and bass clarinet on the top line of the staff. But the actual leitmotivic part, the little melody or little bit of a melody, which is on, it's reproduced on the second line of this, the parts that are labeled flute and oboe. That part is just as unsettling and unresolved as the trill. It's a simple little shaking gesture and then a drop. Da. It sometimes reminds me of Ennio Morricone's main theme from the Western film The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. You might know. It's got that same open and empty feel, and we can almost sense something sinister about it, though it remains a riddle, Salome's second leitmotif. Especially when it's paired with that trill, we remain on the edge of our seats, waiting for something to happen. The something terrible that Herod and the page foresee, but which never comes or will come eventually. But for most of the opera, we're on edge waiting for it to happen. I've heard this leitmotif referred to as Salome's enigmatic nature, and I think that's an excellent label for it, since it doesn't, since this leitmotif doesn't get too specific. It leaves the riddle unsolved and the tension unresolved. So we can see from this Jochanaan leitmotif, the earlier one I showed, and these two main Salome leitmotifs, that Strauss often employs his leitmotifs to convey different facets of characters, to encapsulate aspects of their personalities. But there's one leitmotif that's less a representation of Salome herself than of some idea or obsession that has entered her mind and taken hold of her. Following the dialogue with Jochanaan, Salome's dialogue, there's a lengthy tone poem-like interlude in which the prophet is escorted back to his prison and Salome is left alone. The sound of his leitmotifs, including the hymn-like one we heard, repeat incessantly during this orchestral interlude, as if Jochanaan's words were echoing in Salome's ears. At the very end of the interlude, there's a moment of relative calm, and then arising out of the orchestra comes an insistent new leitmotif in the brass, specifically the horns, the trumpet, and the trombone. Let's listen to that part. It's got the same steady pulse of Jochanaan's leitmotif, but none of the solemnity and religious piety. We get three pitches hammered out, then we rise up a minor third to hold an upper pitch, then we descend back to the home pitch before rising up in a thrust-like motion. Bum, 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 ba, ba, bum. What is this? The visuals on stage tell us this has something to do with Salome, since she's left all alone. Yet this can't be a representation of Salome herself. We've already heard the leitmotifs that represent her, like the two I played, and we would have heard this introduced earlier in the opera at her entrance, if it stood in for the princess. No, this is some thought that has entered her mind, and that's not going to go away. In both psychology and the arts, this is what's termed an idée fixe, French for fixed idea. In early psychology, this was an irrational obsession, a desire or object that a person, usually a mentally ill person, can't banish from their mind. In the arts, it's typically a literary or visual image or a musical theme like this one that reappears in a work obsessively. In literature, it's not just a simple recurring motif like all the snakes that I mentioned in Harry Potter. This is something that haunts a character in the psychological sense of an idée fixe. Think of Captain Ahab's obsession with hunting down Moby Dick. Moby Dick, in that case, would be the idée fixe. Like Salome's enigmatic nature motive, this new leitmotif will set us on edge precisely because we don't yet know what it symbolizes. But from its musical character, we know that it can't be something pleasant. This idée fixe repeats incessantly throughout the score from this point on, but there are certain appearances at crucial moments in the drama that might offer some clues as to what it means. For instance, we hear it right before the Dance of the Seven Veils. Herod asks Salome to dance. She's agreed to this by this point, and since he's sworn his oath. And we hear the idée fixe in the same instrumentation as the first appearance, that is horn, trumpet, and trombone. We hear it just before Salome says, "I'm ready, Tetrarch. Ich bin bereit, Tetrarch." The thought that the idée fixe represents has momentarily entered Salome's mind, and then she says she's ready, that she's ready to dance. Strauss is telling us here that whatever reason Salome is dancing for has to do with whatever this idée fixe stands for. Again, we don't know at this point what that is, but we know it's what's on Salome's mind as she prepares to dance and then says she's ready. It's also what's on her mind while she dances. Now, Strauss's Dance of the Seven Veils is a tricky little number to discuss. On the one hand, it's very much in the spirit of 19th century Orientalist ballet numbers that composers used to feature in their operas. Our old pal Saint-Saëns had a comparable dance sequence in Samson and Delilah called the Danse Bacchanale, the Bacchanalia dance, where the wicked Philistines perform a wild and uninhibited dance to worship their pagan god. Strauss, like Saint-Saëns, tries to imitate what his idea of Middle Eastern music sounds like. And you can imagine that early choreography for the Dance of the Seven Veils wouldn't have been that different from this absolutely hilarious attempt at belly dancing from the Met's 1983 performance of the Danse Bacchanale that you just saw. But if we look beyond the kitschy and maybe even mildly offensive Orientalist facade of Strauss's Dance of the Seven Veils, there's something genuinely interesting going on from a leitmotivic perspective. While Strauss introduces some new and exotic sounding themes here, a la Saint-Saëns, much of the dance is constructed from the leitmotifs that we've already heard. This isn't merely diegetic music. Remember, that's the music that the characters themselves can hear within the world of the opera. And on one level, the Dance of the Seven Veils does represent diegetic music. You could even have a stage band on stage with strange instruments. You could invent new instruments, idea for a production there. So on the one hand, we get this very loud crash. Some of the moments in the Dance of the Seven Veils are supposed to be the orchestra tuning up or giving these loud crashing sounds. There's lots of great percussion in it, very clangy percussion. So in that sense, it is diegetic music, but it's not merely diegetic music. It's also what we might call psychological music. That is music that tells us what's going on in the mind of the protagonist, Salome, as she dances. For instance, there are moments where we can hear Jochanan's rising leitmotif, the da 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 da. So its associations with a holy man might seem utterly inappropriate leitmotif for a striptease, but it's less a representation of the diegetic dance music, the music that the characters on stage can hear, than it is a representation of what is going on in Salome's head while she dances. It gives us a glimpse into her psyche. And it seems that the words of the prophet are still ringing in her mind. As you'd expect, the idée fixe that we've been discussing, the dum bum 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 ba da dum, that idée fixe also reappears. Sometimes Strauss only gives us the first three notes, which act like a little ostinato or a riff for the dance. There's parts that go, so it's like a little riff that's playing. So it takes on a dance-like quality to mix the diegetic side of this dance with the psychological side of this dance. The most thrilling instance, though, is at the climax, where it helps to propel us toward what we think is a big finish. I'll point out that, as in the other two examples that we've heard of the idée fixe, it's played by the brass. But notice how we don't immediately go out with a big fireworks cadence. After the idée fixe, Strauss inserts Salome's enigmatic nature leitmotif, the down, with its uneasy trill. And the stage directions tell us that she remains for an instant in a visionary attitude, very symbolist turn of phrase there, near the cistern where Jochanan is kept prisoner. She's gazing down into the darkness. Is whatever the idée fixe represents down there in the dark? But only Jochanan's there, and maybe some rats. We already have a leitmotif for Jochanan, so that can't be what she's thinking about, because then we would hear one of his leitmotifs. So what's down in that cistern that is obsessing Salome? Of course, you've already probably figured out by now that this idée fixe doesn't represent Jochanan the man, but rather Salome's obsessive desire to possess his severed head. After she dances and Herod asks what she wishes as her reward, she sings the idée fixe leitmotif to this phrase, Ich will den Kopf des Jochanan. From the very beginning then, this has been a kind of secret Morse code for that phrase, since when it appears earlier in the opera, it follows the rhythm of that text, even though it's not sung to that text. And note in German that Jochanan, his name is pronounced Jochanan, with na-an being two syllables. That's how you get the Jochanan, the extra note in there. The leitmotif becomes all the more incessant as Salome unflinchingly demands what she's due, that severed head that has occupied her thoughts for the past hour or so. The progression and development of this leitmotif, I think, is the most fascinating aspect of Strauss's opera. We're granted musical insight into Salome's psychology, though only gradually. We know this idée fixe preoccupies and consumes her. Whether or not we know what the idée fixe theme represents, its presence is something that claws upon our minds, just as it claws on Salome's. Strauss makes sure of that, so that we as an audience become obsessive like Salome. This opera premiered at the time that Sigmund Freud was formulating his theories on human sexuality and the unconscious. And there are so many ways in which Strauss's musical treatment of Salome's neurosis overlaps with Freud's ideas. Just take a look at what Freud says about fetishism, which is the transference of sexual desire to a non-sexual object, say a foot or a severed head. But to tie up our discussion, I'd rather have us return to what we observed about Oscar Wilde's novel treatment of Salome. How, rather than placing the agency with Herodias, who in the Gospel of Matthew comes up with the plot to kill John the Baptist and merely uses her daughter Salome as a tool, Wilde changes the plot and makes Salome herself the mastermind of this scheme. This idée fixe is the musical manifestation of Wilde's alteration to the plot. Strauss shows how Salome is more than the beautiful femme fatale represented in the first clarinet leitmotif, how she has an unstoppable resolve. Even if the end goal is something terrible, we're nevertheless left in awe of Salome's obsessive determination and her ability to get what she wants. The melody of the idée fixe leitmotif, more than a translation of the text into a musical rhythm, also encapsulates Salome's unrelenting drive with its contour. It focuses the energy in that repeated first note, dum, bum, bum, and then it unleashes that energy with that upward thrust on the name Yohanan. Yohanan! Now, Strauss doesn't totally reduce his heroine to a heartless vamp. Once she gets what she's after, she performs one of the greatest monologues in operatic history. Her aria to Jochanan's head is a glorious apotheosis, the moment of mystical release that comes when a princess's dreams come true. And indeed, Strauss's music is magical here. It's a clear nod to Isolde's Liebestod with grand lyrical phrases for Salome that soar higher and higher in heavenly arching phrases as she sings triumphantly, "I have kissed your mouth, Jochanan." As with Wilde's text, Strauss remains mostly non-judgmental here. He gives Salome the opportunity to express her genuine love for Jochanan's head and the Wagnerian ecstasy she feels, an orgasmic sensation that's equal parts spiritual and sexual. That is, until Strauss gives us a wake-up call and reminds us what exactly she's singing to. At the climax of Salome's monologue, after she's proclaimed, "I've kissed your mouth, Jochanan," one last time, Strauss drops on us a putrid, stinking harmony, an unimaginably dissonant combination of an A7 chord and an F-sharp major chord, two chords which do not belong together and which blare out of the orchestra with a pang-like sforzando. The best description of this harmony, which I've marked with one of Beardsley's little demons for good reason, the best description of this harmony comes from the scholar Gary Schmidgall, from this week's optional reading, where he writes that this dissonance is, quote, the quintessence of decadence. Here is ecstasy falling in upon itself, crumbling into the abyss at the sound of the most sickening chord of all opera. We've turned the bejeweled shell over to find a rotting tortoise with maggots squirming over its festering corpse. Herod sees something like this when Salome, who has been shrouded in darkness, is suddenly illuminated by moonlight. The Tetrarch can't let this continue. Kill that woman. Salome has lost that powerful agency that she claimed for most of the opera, and she's been transformed by Herod into an object, like a bug, to be crushed under shields. Does she deserve it? I'll let you decide that for yourselves and maybe even address it in your final projects. But I think we might have some indication of what Strauss himself thinks. Just before the curtain falls, we hear something resembling that squawking woodwind motive that stood in for both a peacock's cry and a cynical laugh. Could it be Salome's cry, a beautiful peacock slaughtered in preparation for a meal? Or is it someone laughing? Maybe Strauss, or maybe just one of those horrid little imps that cackle from the corners of Beardsley's illustrations.